All right. Good afternoon. Well, good morning. I guess it's still morning. It feels like afternoon. I appreciate everyone joining us today. We're going to be spending some time today talking about the 2021 point in time count. The first half of our session today, we're going to be talking about the point in time count results and the information that we have to share from the report. I'll be monitoring the chat, so feel free to use the chat for questions, and we'll try and address those at the end of the front part of the presentation. And then the second half of our call, we're going to hand it over to some of our community partners to do some education and sharing on what kind of they observed from their experiences serving folks in the last year. You know, we have a lot of data and numbers to share with you all, but there are a lot of stories as well about folks' experiences, the challenges and successes they saw on the ground. And I think it just provides context to what we're seeing in these numbers, to have a chance to hear these stories from folks like our friends at Horizon House, our friends that work with the Professional Blended Street Outreach Team, those at Wheeler Mission, Shelter for Men, and Center for Women and Children, and then our friends that have been working in rehousing like Barb Williams. So we're going to hand it over to those folks on the second half. Again, feel free to use the chat to ask questions, and we'll make sure we get to those. If you do have a question and you'd like to ask it out loud, we'll also try the raise hand feature if you prefer to do that. I'll try and keep an eye on those as well. But if you do need to hop off, we will be sending out this recording after we're done. And if you registered, you'll get it in your email. And we'll also make sure that it's available to those if you want to shoot me an email directly to get a copy too. So just one moment, I will go ahead and put it on mute and hand it over to Sal. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. So can everyone see my slides? Is everyone seeing the PowerPoint slides that I have?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. So hi, everyone. If you don't know me, my name is Sal Munoz. I am the lead data analyst over here with CHIP. And so today I'm going to be presenting some of the point in time count results that we've had. And we are also going to talk and contextualize these results a little bit with some of the housing inventory counts results that we also have received. So we'll be looking at both the results that we got from the point in time count, in addition to the information that we received in terms of how our housing inventory has been growing and shifting over the past couple of years. So, sorry, was there a question? All right.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to start off with talking about the point in time and contextualizing everything in regards to the pandemic landscape. There were changes in our methodology that had to occur because of the pandemic. Then we'll go into some of the point in time count results and talk through some of the data, some of the increases that we've seen as a community in terms of the total amount of people homeless and how some of the homeless demographics have shifted this previous year. And then again, as I mentioned, I'll contextualize everything through the housing inventory count to show you how we have changed and adjusted as we've gone forth. And then finally, we're going to end off everything with just a couple of key takeaways before switching it over to some of the frontline staff. So because of the pandemic, we had to change some of our methodology from previous years. Now, just to kind of set our groundwork, the point in time count, it's a HUD mandated count of all persons experiencing homelessness in both shelters and in unsheltered situations. Shelters being emergency shelters, safe havens, and transitional housing. And so some of those shelters might be funded through ESG, some of those might be private. We count everyone that is considered a part of a shelter. And I also want to mention that shelters are also include hotel or motel rooms that are paid for by emergency funds, which we had a significant amount of this year because of the fact that, the pandemic was occurring and we had to decompress shelters and make sure that people were able to abide by the 6-foot rule so that we allowed enough space for folks to not pack them all in. So the count has been occurring since 2005, and typically when we do a count, we're looking at basic demographic and housing situation details. So figuring out who they are, and then also in terms of what their housing situation has been like. And this really helps us to develop a better understanding of the needs of our general community and helps to inform the allocation of resources. A lot of our system performance measures and a lot of the federal competitions in the past have used the point in time count as a way to gauge which communities may need more funding. Have you been able to effectively decrease, veterans homelessness? Have you been able to decrease chronic homelessness? And they'll use the point in time count to review that and to confirm that. So that also plays into the importance of this count as well. So what, typically on an average night, in an average year where we didn't have a global pandemic, the point in time count would occur only on one night during the last few weeks of January, specifically the last 10 days of January. Anyone that's enrolled in shelters will have their data pulled from HMIS. So we are typically pulling that information directly from HMIS, which is the Homeless Management Information System. If there are other databases, for example, victim service providers, domestic violence shelters, they will submit their information to us. And there are some shelters that may not be using HMIS that are privately funded that will send us surveys and information of the folks that they have in their shelter during that night. And then for unsheltered folks, it's a little different. So we don't pull information directly from HMIS, although this year we did a little bit of that. But typically unsheltered folks in the past have been surveyed on one night by a mix of outreach staff and volunteers, and they complete a paper survey for the most part. So what were some of the impacts and changes this year that caused us to change our methodology? Well, again, it wasn't a typical year, and a lot of continuums across the country were granted exemptions by HUD for the unsheltered count. So we had there was a discussion in our continuum whether we should even do an unsheltered count. We decided to move forward with an unsheltered count, but we know of other COCs that just forewent it entirely. And I'll also mention that in talking with other providers across the nation and other HMIS administrators, they've also noticed that there was a significant change in how data in their results that they had this year. So, some COCs, some HMIS leads had noted a mass increase in their sheltered persons. Others had noted a mass decrease in their sheltered persons, and that decrease could be because certain providers didn't submit for the point in time count or didn't have the capacity to engage in the point in time counts. For our continuum, we really tried, and we made a significant effort to try to involve everyone and get as much information as we possibly could and source that information wherever we could for sheltered folks. So, we did a very thorough count this year, and instead of sort of undercounting, I feel like we made an effort to engage providers and engage folks so that we can get an accurate and full count. So one major element that changed that you'll see in the numbers is the methodology changes for counting unsheltered individuals. So in years past, we do only one night survey unsheltered individuals with a mix of volunteers and outreach staff, and that's about it. So this year, it changed. This year, we sent out only outreach teams to complete the count. There were no volunteers. And people that were counted on the night of the pit, so we counted folks from Monday until the rest of the week to ask them where they were on the night of the pit. If they responded that they were unsheltered, then we included their information in the PIT. And what we ensured was that we try to make sure that people were not counted twice. We deduplicated the data set using location information as well as any demographics or identifying information that we were provided. And the unsheltered survey was also shortened so that we did that as an effort to ensure that there's less possibility of contamination between the worker and the person that they're surveying, just so that there's no additional risk of passing something on or anything of that sort. And I want to mention that this methodology change was approved by HUD. So all this we had to get approved by HUD in order to be able to move in that direction. So what are some of the repercussions from this? Given the methodology changes, we have now seen an increase in the total amount of unsheltered people. Because we're not concentrating on a single night, we saw several more people throughout the week that we might have not typically seen, right? On any given night, maybe a person's at another encampment or elsewhere, but they're still unsheltered, and they come back to the encampment on Tuesday, and we're able to engage them and find out that they were still unsheltered on the night of the pit. So it allows us a wider breadth of folks that we can engage with and count. And like I had mentioned, this sort of helps to support that point that we had a wider scope of unsheltered individuals that we were able to engage with because we had a longer time frame. And instead of it being concentrated on one single night, where we might, the potential of missing a few folks, of missing a significant portion of people, we did it over a weekend. We're able to engage many more. But because of the shortened survey, one issue that we encountered was that we were not able to capture some data elements regarding an unsheltered person's education and their full housing histories that can help us to determine whether they are chronically homeless or not. And additionally, what I want to mention is that we do not have a very detailed location data. So for information regarding how many people were downtown on the night of the pit, et cetera, that is not information that we were not able to receive this year. And we did not have volunteers that were dedicated to certain geographies. So it was the outreach team going throughout and engaging anyone that they were able to engage. And instead of it being, we have team 1, team 2, team 3 go, take on downtown, take on the north side, take on the south side, et cetera. Instead, it was all throughout. So in terms of how we did the count for the methodology for the sheltered count, we pulled any data for clients that were enrolled in the following project types on January 18th, 2021. So if they were enrolled in an emergency shelter, transitional housing, or safe haven, we pulled their data from HMIS. And again, if a provider does not use HMIS, or they are a victim service provider, domestic violence shelter, something of that sort, then we would reach out to them and ask for that data. So a couple of things to mention about some data collection issues that we had. For non-congregate shelters, the way that those programs were set up, unfortunately, they were sort of rolled into pre-existing programs. So we are not able to provide information specific in terms of demographics specific to who had engaged with non-congregate shelters on the night of the pit. So that is one data collection issue that we had encountered this year. And again, as previously mentioned, we do not have chronicity data on the folks that were unsheltered because those questions are not part of the survey. And in addition, data quality on average was a little lower this year than in years past. And a lot of this is likely due to capacity, having to enter all that information as it's swelling up, as we're scaling up rapidly, likely caused a lot of providers to not have the capacity to check and maintain their data quality for that time. So where applicable, we would use previous historical data for items that made sense, right? So if it's race, ethnicity, those elements we felt comfortable using historically provided data. If there was no data, if there was missing data, or if there was data that was not collected. But something like income or their housing situation, that's something that changes rapidly enough where we didn't feel comfortable using that information to calculate whether a client is indeed, whether they have income or a disability or health insurance, because those things can change frequently. So I mentioned all that methodology information to bring us to the point in time count results. So let's get into the numbers. Overall, we had 1,928 total individuals that were counted for this year's point in time count. 263 of those were unsheltered and 1,665 were unsheltered. And in terms of how that compares to last year, you could see that there's a pretty significant increase across the board. So in terms of sheltered individuals, we had almost an increase of over 200. For unsheltered individuals, it was an increase of nearly 80. So across the board, we saw a significant jump in the total amount of people that were homeless in the system, both sheltered and unsheltered. So now moving over to folks that, the type of location that they were at, again, we saw a significant increase in the amount of people that were in emergency shelter during that time. And we saw a decrease in the total amount of people that were in transitional housing. So part of the reason that could be relevant to that is that particularly for veterans, we saw that there was a emergency shelter that was set up by the VA, where we believe many of their GPD clients would have stayed in GPD, and that transitional housing project might have gone to the emergency shelter because it's a hotel room that's paid, and maybe the clients felt more comfortable there or staying there on that particular night. So that accounts for the decrease in transitional housing, and likely also accounts for the increase that we saw in the emergency shelter. So that's sort of the flip that we see. And then in terms of unsheltered, again, there's a increase that we had seen total. And I think a lot of that has to do with the methodology being more robust and and collecting more and better data. So while it's an increase in the total number of unsheltered folks, and that's not something we like to see, we do believe that the methodology is an improved methodology and allows us a better breadth of understanding who is truly unsheltered rather than a one night blitz. And then, of course, we have safe havens. If you're not familiar, a safe haven is essentially a emergency shelter that typically has a longer use frame for clients, and it also contains it has a requirement of severe mental illness, typically. So in terms of how we can break this down by demographics at this point, we saw a decrease in the number of males that were so these numbers are for the total 1,900 some folks. So we saw a total decrease in the amount of males and a increase in the amount of females that were in the system. So women seem to have had an increase from last year to this year. Now, when we take a look at age in terms of graphics, we can see, again, there was an uptick between last year and this year. But if we look at the overall trends of data, we can see that older individuals, folks that are over the age of 62, are making up a larger and larger portion of our homeless systems. So these individuals that are over 62 are largely in the emergency shelter room. Only a smaller percentage of them are unsheltered. Largely, they are in emergency shelters if they are over the age of 62. And there's also an uptick among homelessness in those that are aged between 25 to 34 as well. This is the highest recorded that it's been in the past 5 years. And one other element that I want to mention is that the majority of people that are typically unsheltered that we've seen from the data are going to be individuals that were between the ages of 35 to 61. So in terms of the share of folks that are unsheltered, they are typically in the ages of between the ages of 35 to 61, whereas those that are over the age of 62 typically tend to stay in emergency shelter. So as we talk about race and put on a lens of racial equity, we can see that we have had a slight decrease in terms of the ratio of Black or African American individuals in the system itself. And it's held more or less the same. There were slight decreases, but that could also be due to the fact that we had a significant more volume of people that came into the system. And one thing that I want to mention is that individuals that identified as Hispanic or Latino, Latinx came in at 4.5% of the total PIT count. So, and that's split between all of these categories. So again, that's one aspect that's not pictured here in this slide, are those that are Hispanic Latino, which are 4.5% of the total PIT count. So in terms of the racial disparities of folks that are, what's the racial breakdown of those that are unsheltered and sheltered? What we see is that in the unsheltered communities, largely it is white or Caucasian, whereas it's only a fourth Black or African American. And when we look at the shelter data, it's flipped almost entirely, where Black or African American folks are making up nearly 50% of the total sheltered population. And remember, just for the context of the numbers here, the total unsheltered count was 263 individuals, whereas the total sheltered count was 1,665. So still, the ratio, when you look at the ratio and the total numbers, there's still a significantly larger portion of Black individuals in shelter that are homeless. Now, when we talk a little bit about households, and in particular households with at least one adult and one child, there was a increase between those 2 years. So you can see that there's a significant jump in emergency shelters and in transitional housing for both of those. And again, with each of those project types, we see that there's also sort of a corresponding increase in the number of people that are over the age of 24, that are youths, and that are under the age of 18. And because the children already made up such a significant portion, we saw that jump up significantly as well. So I also think it's important to mention that in terms of looking at the racial makeup of this data, of this set of people, and we're talking only about individuals, 74% of them were Black or African American. So families in particular are having a significant, Black-led families are having a significantly difficult time in the shelter system. They are in the shelter system and using a large majority of emergency shelter services. So that is totally disproportionate. As a reminder, in Indianapolis, Black or African American identified household and individuals only make up 29% of the total demographics. So I think that's something that we need to use as a baseline in addressing racial disparities in our system. So I want to talk briefly about some of the housing inventory counts. What you'll notice is that we have a significant jump in the total amount of year-round beds available. So I want to mention that I'm only talking about year-round beds. I'm not including overflow or seasonal beds right now. If we were to include overflow or seasonal beds for emergency shelters, we'd be seeing over 2,000 beds. And largely a lot of that was in relation to the total number of individuals. It's largely in relation to the total number of people that are in the NCS as well, or in emergency winter contingency plans. But a couple of interesting trends that I think should be noted from here is that the emergency shelter did scale up significantly to address the needs of the pandemic. But you can also see that throughout the years, we've had a slight decrease in the total number of permanent supportive housing types and permanent supportive housing beds, but we also saw a significant increase in the total number of other permanent housing and rapid rehousing resources that we had to provide to clients. So other permanent housing means that it could be affordable housing, vouchers, things of that nature. And again, rapid rehousing, there's been a significant push for rapid rehousing over the past couple of years that account for that number going up. And so I want to talk briefly about the emergency shelter and some of the overflow emergency shelter beds. Here you could see that when we look at the total addition of year-round beds, we see that there's it's 369 beds that were added that are year-round, that are more permanent beds. And in terms of seasonal and overflow, we see there's 105 seasonal beds and 312 overflow beds. And we believe that this increase is largely due to the fact that there are that the NCS non-congregate shelter beds were rolled into some of these programs, rolled into some of the HIC beds. So that is partially accounting for some of the increase that we've seen in the system and as emergency shelter beds. So what are some of the key takeaways that we've taken from this? So, going back to methodology and talking a little bit more about process, some of the issues that we've found is that a lot of our emergency shelter system is decentralized. So not every emergency shelter transitional housing program is required. It enters information into HMIS. So when that occurs, it causes challenges in that, the way the program is set up, the way data is structured for us to be able to analyze, we're not, there's no centralized or standardized way to do that if we're getting information from disparate sources and from disparate systems. So that has been a challenge that we are trying to think through and address in years, in the months that are coming. And one thing to also note is that the pandemic is really going to have lasting impacts for our community in the years to come. This data, we're going to, when we are going to do our longitudinal system analysis, or when we submit additional reports to HUD, or do a review of our performance from last year to this year will be an aberration. This year will have continuing impacts in the way that we have to analyze data in the system. And in terms of point number 3, one thing that we want to implement for likely this year, for the last quarter of this year, will be a practice point in time count to help prepare some of the shelters for being able to review their data, clean their data, get them sort of in the motion of being able to prep and immediately pull the point in time count information and ensure that on the night of the pit, in January 2022, they're able to ensure that all the information is already ready. They might have already cleaned it up in the month or 2 months prior when we do this practice pit. And in terms of key takeaways from the data that we had seen, this PIT count has been the highest number that our COC has seen in the last 10 years. This is the peak of total homeless people that we've had in our system. And again, with unsheltered clients, we went from a 5-year low of 108 in 2019 to 263. Now that low occurred on the night where it was the polar vortex. So we had really bad weather that night, and we believe that many of those clients that were unsheltered might have gone to shelter that night to avoid that significantly bad weather. And again, those identifying as Black or African American continue to be disproportionately represented in the homeless population. So again, remembering that Black folks make up 29% of the total Indianapolis demographics, 54% of the PIT count population was Black. Of the McKinley-Vento eligible youth, 59% were also Black. And of the 401 people in family shelters, 74% of those were Black. And again, this marks, and finally, another demographic that is experiencing an increase, those that are older than 62 are continuing to experience more and more homelessness. We see more of them in the shelter system as well. So here are some resources that we have. We have the point in time dashboard, a full report that was written for 2021 by the Indianapolis University's Public Policy Institute, and then a link to other PIT reports of years past. And if you have any questions, feel free to email info@chipindy.org. And I'm going to pass it over to Rachel.
Just a couple of questions that were in the chat that I want to make sure we address before we move on to our partners. Sal, do you have any context around whether or not other cities, not in this year's count, but just in the past, whether or not other cities typically do more than one night of counting on the point in time count, and how that might influence how we change our methodology?
In years past, from my understanding, no. Years past, typically an unsheltered count only occurs on that single night. There's no week-long model. So I haven't seen it as a common practice in the previous COC that I was a part of, nor do I know many colleagues that do it that way, that had done it that way. This year might be a change, and it might be a paradigm shift.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I know that we'll be talking with our planning committee and looking at HUD guidance around how we might do this count differently in the future related to the length of time we're spending counting. The one question I think we are able to already address regarding whether or not cities all use the same day to conduct the count. It's typically done the last 10 days of January, and we just did a little bit of a different timeline so that we had more time.
Yes.
And then the last thing I just wanted to quickly address, because I'm sure some people's ears perked up when you mentioned a practice point in time count. You're talking about doing that with our shelter, transitional housing, and safe haven partners, right? We're not going to ask our street outreach workers to practice the PIT.
Yeah, so sorry to my street outreach worker folks. No, that's not intended for you. It's more so intended for the sheltered folks. So there's no need to worry.
Yeah, Nicole can breathe a sigh of relief. We're not going to ask you to do the point in time count multiple times. We ask so much of our street outreach workers on one night, and they help us so much in our preparations already. So we appreciate their support very, very much. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to our partners to share more about last year, unless we have any further questions. Does anyone have any other questions about the data and the information we shared today? Great. Okay, well, I'd love to hand it over to our friends at Horizon House. Kevin, Nicole, I see you both on here. If you wouldn't mind just sharing more about giving us some context about these numbers that we see, as you guys worked last year in the day center and then with PBSO. Tell us about, did you also observe increases in numbers? Oh yeah, and Leslie too. Hello, Leslie. Anything else you observed that maybe supports this or looks different than this information, and any other successes or challenges you want to share?
Well, I can start, Rachel. This is Leslie. I apologize to everybody. My camera is not working as of yesterday, so I'm not trying to be mysterious, but I have no camera capability on my laptop right now. Yeah, a lot about what Sal shared from the results of the count do resonate, and I would say probably the pieces that resonate, and the count, of course, is after we had already been involved, for quite a while in experiencing some changes with services. But we started in March, the 23rd of March of last year, 2020, is when Horizon House started adjusting our services because of COVID. So we tried to continue offering the most necessary and basic services that we could to our neighbors on a daily basis, but also doing that in as safe a way as possible based on the early guidance that was coming from the health department and the CDC. So beginning on Monday, March the 23rd, we started doing walk-through services as opposed to allowing people to come in and stay in the day room. Because we were doing walkthrough, of course, that meant there were certain services that we were not offering, like showers and laundry. But we were doing health screenings with everybody as they came in, taking temperatures, and using the health screening that the health department had recommended, which was to look for symptoms and really try to help identify people that might need to be referred for medical care and or testing. So during that walkthrough process, people could get basic hygiene items at our front desk. They could get socks. If we had emergency clothing needs, of course, we were filling those. And people could check their mail. And then we were doing carry out food as people were leaving. So sandwiches, snacks, and water or Gatorade, that kind of thing. At the same time we started that walkthrough service, we also redeployed some of our service center staff to street outreach because we anticipated that there were going to be a lot of people on the street or just unsheltered. We were already experiencing pretty high numbers of people unsheltered prior to the pandemic in the downtown area. And then as we were, as a community, trying to reduce the numbers of people in the shelters to add to safety, we also knew that that was going to really lead to more people being unsheltered. And we were hearing that some people were afraid to go to shelter because of the close quarters. So we redeployed 5 or 6 of our service center staff to be able to work at least on a part-time basis on outreach teams. In terms of the numbers that we saw here in the service center, we did see a decrease in numbers, which I think makes perfect sense because, as I just mentioned, we had more people staying outside. And then as we started opening up the non-congregate shelters, people were going there and, quite frankly, not in as much need to come to Horizon House if they were already in a non-congregate shelter setting where they had shelter, access to showers, and meals daily. So that's a little bit about what we were seeing here. I'd like to kind of turn it over to Nicole then to talk about more specifically what was going on for PBSO at the start of the pandemic and then leading up to the count in January of 2021, and how they responded to the change in methodology.
Thanks, Leslie. Thanks, Rachel. Just to be mindful and respectful of the agenda, I can send out a handout for distribution. I don't know, I'll have enough time to cover all of my talking points. So I'm happy to do that, but I can just talk briefly. So as Leslie mentioned, March 23rd, there were a few of us that kind of got together, and what seemed like a 24-hour period, we developed and implemented the food outreach distribution project, and we kind of recycled the PIT model, if you will. So we assigned teams to quadrants. We had a Monday through Friday outreach schedule. Each team had their route, and they would visit folks at their encampment and distribute food, PPE supplies. They conducted COVID screenings. So that food outreach distribution project lasted from March through the end of June. And it was pretty intense, but I think we were successful in that. So overall, I would say, COVID pandemic presented lots of unprecedented challenges, not only for the food outreach project, but for the 2021 PIT count. PBSO quickly adapted to new kind of modified procedures and protocols, but the main challenges were capacity limitations and safety standards, which ultimately affected our communication, our coordination, and our collaboration efforts. So in terms of capacity, to ensure a safe 4-month distribution project in a 5-day count, we did our best to maximize outreach team capacity. PBSO, IMPD, homeless unit, and FBSO teams were very flexible to adjust their quote unquote normal outreach schedule to ensure coverage of all the quadrants in Marion County. In terms of communication and coordination and collaboration, to ensure that all unsheltered individuals in encampments were encountered, we activated a communication thread via text messaging and email with all of the participating PBSO and FBSO team members to provide updates on encampments that had been visited for the distribution project and surveyed for the count. In terms of safety guidance, to ensure safety for everyone, I worked closely with Lieutenant McLemore to keep PBSO and FBSO informed of potential security threats and political protests that were anticipated during the spring and summer of 2020 and before and after the inauguration, which was during the week of the PIT count. So in response to these concerns, we developed contingency plans, provided safety guidance, and restructured protocols to ensure safety for outreach teams as well as unsheltered individuals. Overall, I would say that 2020 was an accomplishment. I'm trying to challenge my pessimism. It was a very traumatic, difficult, challenging year, but I think, it was a victory lap of sorts. We transcended from these obstacles and hurdles, and I believe we're stronger because of it. So we try to celebrate our collaborative efforts among PBSO, IMPD, and FBSO. And so I just want to take this opportunity to acknowledge that we collectively accomplished this undertaking together, and it just proves efficacy with the collaborative work.
Thank you, Nicole. That was so great to hear. And yes, absolutely, 100,000 rounds of applause for everybody who was working on the street last year and with folks in need services. Thank you so much. Can I pass it over to our friends at Wheeler, William and Mary Beth? I saw Shauna there too for a second, so I'd just love to hear from you guys. If you could talk just a little bit more about what the sheltering experience was like for those of you who had to really pivot your shelter operations. I do believe the hotel sheltering for men obviously started sooner than it did for families. So things are a little bit different between the two of you. So we'd love to hear more about what that experience was like and any successes and challenges you saw. And if you also felt like the information seen in the PIT count was reflective of things you saw in your shelter.
Okay, William, go first.
Why y'all always make me go first? I was gonna let you're supposed to be women first, right?
Good at what you do. You're so good at what you do. That's why we love you so much.
Well, hello everyone. I think this all this information, excuse all my, can y'all see my face? Hey. Thanks for the time. Just kind of discuss, just the things that we went through in COVID. If you remember, when COVID hit, it hit, right? And it hit hard. And I think right at the time that COVID hit, I think we had roughly around 400 guys in the building. It was right at the end of winter contingency. So in terms of pivoting, I think our biggest issue was the social distancing piece, right? When it comes to social distancing with over 400 guys in the building, right? Then that's an issue of buildings and different spaces. I'll tell you the one thing that really made the difference with us was community. I think initially, right there at the beginning, one church, I can't think of the name right now, Neighborhood Fellowship Church, right off 10th Street, they offered us their basement to house about 50 guys for the long term. And then the health department came through, of course. Karen Holly, if you don't know Karen Holly and Dana, you're missing out. They're the best. But they came through and I think initially, because of all the things that were happening, we just didn't know, what was going on. So they ended up using community centers where we placed like 50 guys that also got moved to the state fairgrounds. Then finally, I guess they realized it was going to be a while. So that's when they got moved to the hotels. So again, our number one priority at that time, because of the numbers, was those who were vulnerable, right? Those who are at high risk for COVID, those who could die, those who could have major issues with COVID. I think that was our priority at that point. And then as the information would come out about COVID, if you remember at that time, we didn't have none of the information. So we didn't know what was what. All we knew was that, there was a vulnerable population. And dealing with that, I think that was the key for us because as you know, and as we've seen from the pit count, a lot of our guests and a lot of those who come through our doors fall within that category. So making sure and understanding that you had a place, you had spaces for them to do what they needed to do and to be separated was vital for us. And I was just so glad that we were able to do that with the help from Marion County and other places like that. In terms of rules, I mean, we kept pretty much everything kind of the same. We still had the shelter folks. One of the things that we were able to see from that, if you probably don't know this, but prior to COVID, I mean, we operated the building off of controlled movement, meaning, hey, from this time to this time, everybody's in the cafeteria. From this time to this time, everybody's in the day room. And because of social distancing and having all those people in one place, we couldn't do that, right? So one thing that we embarked on that we were like terrified of at first was we opened the building up and we let people just pretty much, if you want to go in the dorm, you can go in the dorm. If you want to go out to the patio dorm, I mean, we opened it up for people to be able to move around and spread around and things like that. And that helped us a lot. Of course, we did get a lot of people who they just left. They didn't want to come in, which was understandable. But again, our main focus during that time was socially distancing people and spreading them out and getting them situated. Is that Colleen right there in the background? Hi, Colleen. Now, one of the other challenges that we had, and I wonder how everybody else had to deal with this, was compliance, getting the guests to wear masks, getting the guests to sanitize their hands, getting the guests to, I mean, especially in the beginning, that was just a hard thing for us to do. It was something that they wasn't necessarily used to. And I mean, it was torture for us after a while. We didn't necessarily want to get to a point where we would tell people you can't be here if you don't wear a mask, but I think eventually we got there. I think overall, just for lack of time, and then I can answer anything else with questions. I think overall, what I was most satisfied about was the low number of cases that we actually had during COVID. I think that all those things that happened in the beginning helped us to protect as many guests as possible. I think if I remember specifically in the beginning, I think we only had maybe 20, 25 people total throughout that first 4, 5, 6 months. And I think 19 of them were staff. So like our whole staff in the beginning, our whole staff went out. And, you know, we were literally operating the building with 2 or 3 people who was pretty much here 24 hours a day for a few days. So I think that was the biggest takeaway, the biggest success for me was that, and I think overall from what I remember, I think we only lost 1 person to death during the COVID season. So, you know, I was most proud of that. I think that when winter contingency did come back around, though, the issue we ran into was we were faced with, we either socially distance or we turn people away. And or we let everybody come back in, right? And I think that the during that winter season, we had to make the choice to just let people in. And that social distance piece, we lost a lot of that. But again, I think at that point, you know, we had to weigh the option of, do we want to try to protect them inside this building, or do we want them to try to fend for themselves on the outside? And I think, you know, Willa mentioned we're going to choose to do everything we can by providing somewhere for people to be off the street during that time. So, and we didn't have any major issues during that time as well. So, you know, we was protected. Thank God for that. So, as far as the shelter, that's kind of how it was. I'll leave it to the women to explain them.
Thanks, William. I would like to apologize for our Chief Program Officer who did not know the camera was on. Hi, Matt.
I saw your note.
Hi, guys. So not a whole lot. Most of you guys were involved in this process and have a general idea of how it worked for us, but we definitely knew heading into winter contingency that when we're Wheeler, we're not going to turn people away, and we're not going to cap our numbers, but we were going to need to, because we did not have capacity to socially distance. So it just really ended up being wonderful that we could partner in the way that we did to open the hotels. So before this year, we've really haven't seen much higher than, I would say around 100, up a little bit above 100 has been our top numbers in winter contingency. And this year there were nights where we saw more than 350. So it was very, very heavily increased. And I know that there were lots of different reasons for that. We did find that we needed to rely really heavily on our partnerships with the rest of the COC to be able to figure out the referral process, and how do we get people in, how do we verify, and how do we provide resources and make sure that they're getting what they need while they're with us. So it was a very much a collaborative process, and we did learn a lot.
Thank you. Thank you guys for sharing that. I think it helps provide, you know, also reminders of everything that from street outreach to sheltering that changed for people last year, and the journey that our folks went on and that staff went on, the challenges that folks are addressing. And as Nicole said earlier, that this really goes to show the amazing collaborations we have in our community between our faith providers, our professional street outreach providers, our friends at Wheeler, the health department, you know, so on and so forth. It's always wonderful to hear about the ways we have overcome these challenges together as communities. So thank you for sharing that. In closing, I'd like to toss it over to Barb, who is one of the lead rehousing folks over at the non-congregate shelter. And I think you're actually there now, Barb, by looking at your background. I don't know that you go, I don't know if you're anywhere else. Before I turn over, if you haven't had the chance to enjoy the recently released WFYI article that has Barb and others from our community speaking, I'm sure Barb's very, her humility is huge. So I know that's probably uncomfortable for her to have the spotlight shined on her and highlighting her work. But just if you wouldn't mind speaking a little bit about, you know, we have these numbers of people, and what's the work happening now to connect them to housing? We'd love to hear, just in closing, kind of what's happening now.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. And thanks everybody for listening to this. We are we happened at the height of the pandemic when we had to get folks off the streets who were of two types, elderly, 62, 65 and up, and susceptible to COVID, meaning they had some kind of lung issue, asthma, COPD, whatever. They couldn't stay on the street. They couldn't go to Wheeler. They couldn't go anywhere. So so we opened up several hotels, Crown Plaza, Wyndham, extended stays, Hampton Inn. There were hotels all over Indianapolis with these type of folks in them. So we are working with federally funded money from COVID, American Rescue Act, all kinds of other places, to find housing for the folks that are currently here at the hotel. We have about 169 here right now. We have about 70 over at Wyndham. I think those are the only two that are still open, but I could be wrong on that one. So what we're doing, we have a really good, we have Merchants is the donor, the funder of this program. So Merchants has that responsibility. We then have a group of really good people who are beating the bushes for landlords. They have to, as you know, these are not typical folks to go out and get an apartment. An apartment right now is extremely hard under any circumstances to get and to obtain. Housing is an absolute mess right now. So we're asking landlords to not only do that, but also to overlook criminal history, mental health issues, all kinds of things. So the HAT team is doing a really good job of getting landlords to work with us. We then have case management. We will follow these folks along for a year with case management. They are from agencies all over, such as Aspire, ACT, Adult and Child, Horizon House, HIP. Hope I haven't forgotten anybody. They are working with case management to do that. And then CHIP is also involved for the moral support, for the HMIS support, for everything else that CHIP normally does. I am employed by HIP. I don't know specifically what I do over here. I have been described as chief handholder and queen of chaos. So if anything comes up here at the hotel between the staff, the clients, the case management, anybody like that, I've got it. So we also had kudos out to this hotel staff. Right now, Wheeler is the operations of, they are the operations. There's the security. They're the go-to guys if anything happens with any of our guests. But I gotta tell you, this hotel staff, this is not what they signed on for. From the front desk, who are still Crown Plaza employees, they have been phenomenal. I think the real unsung heroes of this entire thing are the housekeeping staff here at the Crown Plaza. These little women go every day and they clean out rooms that I know they did not expect to be cleaning out. They are just the most cheerful, welcoming women I have ever seen in my life, and they go above and beyond. The hotel staff goes above and beyond anything that we could ever ask of them, and it's been phenomenal. We are still housing people. We have, like I say, about 169 here yet to house. Well, here at this hotel, and then about 70, 80 over at Wyndham. So we hope to close this down September 30th and then take this show on the road and go over to the next hotel and then to encampments and then to wherever there's a homeless person in Indianapolis and get them housed. So thanks. This is a phenomenal group of people. It's truly the best that I've ever worked with.
Barb, I gotta say, I loved working with you over winter contingency and that whole referral process. You rocked it out.
Thank you.
You Hip and Horizon House rocked that whole process out this winter. It was great.
Thank you.
Really great. Thank you both.
Thank you guys all so much for sharing your stories and your perspectives and your kudos. And it's wonderful to be a part of such a caring community of people and know that there's people, not just those who traditionally serve folks experiencing homelessness, who continue to contribute to the efforts and the kindness and care that they show for you all, for the folks we serve, and everything is also wonderful to hear. We're going to wrap it up here. If anyone has any further questions, feel free to stay on. If anyone has any other things they'd like to share, and we're happy to listen. I'll keep the recording on for just a couple more minutes in order to capture any of that if we'd like to share anything else. But just thank you all for being here, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.